The thrust of this workshop is to talk about strategies for urban growth and development, some of those lessons that we may have learned from Houston, and some of those challenges that we may have learned as well, and how those may apply to urban areas in Africa and how they might benefit. Before we begin, we have a videotape of what we call the Power of Houston. It talks about some of our assets and some of our successes in Houston. It's a few minutes long. We'd like to play that right now.
A very important objective that I have as mayor is to become much more active in the international marketplace with trade and commerce and tourism and all of that that's important to our city as we continue to grow as a great international city.
Houston is the fourth largest city in the United States. It has hosted such events as the U.S. Olympic Festival in 1986, the Economic Summit of Industrialized Nations in 1990, and the Republican National Convention in 1992. Considered to be the energy capital of the world, Houston's port houses one of the largest petrochemical complexes in the world. It is also the second busiest port in the nation. Houston is also served by two major airports that handle over 1 million passengers a year. South of downtown is the world-famous Medical Center, home to renowned heart surgeons Michael Dept and Denton Cooley. During manned space flights, the world's attention is focused on Houston's NASA Johnson Space Center. For 3 weeks in the late summer of 1998, the world's attention was once again focused on the Bayou City, as 3 major events used the streets of Houston as their stage and captivated, thrilled, and planned the energy future of the world. These events included the Houston Industries Power of Houston 1998, the 17th Congress of the World Energy Council, and the Texaco Championship Auto Race. This year's Houston Industries Power of Houston 1998 was bigger and better, surpassing the majesty and grandeur of last year's inaugural celebration. For 5 days in September, the city of Houston exploded in a glittery display of light and pyrotechnic magic, accented by a diverse mixture of local cuisine and music. Presented at the Great Taste of Houston, the mayor's official fall celebration, the event showcased Houston's finest foods as well as performances by the Houston Symphony and the skyscraping dance troupe Project Bandolin. All this culminated in Sky Power 2. This explosion of fireworks, laser light, and sound was seen by over 3 million people, both on-site and through live television broadcasts locally, and over 32 major television markets across the nation. This event was the largest laser light and fireworks spectacular ever produced in North America. Proceeds from this event benefited the Mayor's Special Parks Fund, Houston Promise, Houston International Festival Education Programs, and the Rudy Tomjanovich Foundation. Houston made history again as it hosted the nations of the world at the 17th Congress of the World Energy Council. Only twice in this century has a United States city hosted this event. Between September 13th and the 18th, over 8,000 delegates from 100 countries, including 200 members of the International Press Corps, converged on Houston, the energy capital of the world, to discuss the future of energy and related technologies that will be crucial to sustain world development in the next century. Delegates were treated to true Texas hospitality. Daily excursions to the colorful surroundings of the region were planned that showed the world what a rich, diverse area exists in this part of Texas. Itineraries were planned to the sunny beaches of Galveston, tours of the Johnson Space Center, as well as choice shopping locales like the Galleria. Visiting dignitaries were given a first-hand look at what Houston has to offer. All this culminated in a special rodeo performance and a Texas-style sit-down dinner for 5,000 guests on the floor of the Houston Astrodome. For the first time ever in the state of Texas, championship auto racing teams transformed the usual downtown Houston street sounds into a cacophony of roaring engines conducted by the cat-like reflexes of some of the world's greatest race car drivers. During October 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, the Texaco Grand Prix of Houston drew over 200,000 people internationally who viewed the event in person. It was also televised live on ABC and rebroadcast later to 188 countries via the All Sports Network ESPN. Michael Andretti, Bobby Rahal, Al Unser Jr., Jimmy Vasser, Christian Fittipaldi, Alex Zandari, Patrick Carpentier, Juan Fanigo. These names are synonymous with the superlatives in the world of auto racing. These men of speed put their legendary racing skills to the test in a history-making high-speed pedal-to-the-metal sprint for the finish line in front of the soon-to-be-expanded George R. Brown Convention Center in downtown Houston. Work crews worked around the clock at a steady pace to prepare the streets of downtown for a new kind of automobile traffic and the most fantastic auto race to occur in the great state of Texas. These events, within the span of 4 weeks in the fall of 1998, demonstrated to the world that Houston is an international city and can rise to the challenge of hosting international events of significant magnitude.
Thank you. This is part of my work as chair of the City Council Subcommittee on International Trade with Africa and the Caribbean. It's a formal City Council Committee and Subcommittee of International Trade. And toward that end, this work that we're involved in now with the Corporate Council of Africa is toward furthering our economic interests with regard to international trade. Not everyone knows it, but 1/3 of all Houston jobs are tied to international trade. Last year, we did some $296 million worth of seaborne trade from Africa alone. So indeed, Houston is the gateway to Africa. We're the home of 70 consulates and 72 different languages are spoken here. And in a real sense, Houston is poised to become a world-class city on the world stage. Now, this effort today was born out of that work as chair of the City Council Subcommittee of International Trade with Africa and the Caribbean. In that regard, I led 2 business development missions to Africa in 1996 and in 1998, and had a chance to tour some of the cities in the southern region of Africa. I would not be so arrogant as to think that I am an expert on urban development and can solve or resolve all of the issues related to Africa, but I think that there may be some ideas, some strategies, some tactics, some programs, some policies that we might be able to share that are part of our success in Houston that may be transferable to Africa. So I'm hopeful today that not only as panelists, but people in the audience can raise some questions and some issues that might help us to come up with some programmatic ideas and thrusts and policy direction that may help some of the urban growth and development in Africa. Now, before I begin, let me kind of lay a context for me. Some wise people say to know who you are is the beginning of wisdom. We say it in the movement another way. If you don't know yourself, then everything that you think you know will only confuse you. So for me, there's a context here. And part of that context is what we see in many emerging countries and what we see in Africa in particular. That we have this paradox. You have Africa, the wealthiest continent on the planet, at the same time the poorest continent on the planet. We see African Americans who probably, of those who are of African descent, among the wealthiest, most technologically trained, most intellectually developed group on earth, disconnected from their ancestry, their culture, their heritage, their geography in Africa. So when we talk about development, we talk about resolving urban strategies. For me, it's part of the liberation movement. It's part of this continuing effort toward liberation, toward justice, toward social transformation that I've been a part of for 25 years. I come to this work as an elected official, having spent the entire body of my adult life in civil and human rights, having been on the front line with the Free South Africa movement, the Southern Africa Task Force, the effort to deal with Rwandan refugees, being mentored by Mickey Leland and trying to respond to the Ethiopian crisis. And knowing that, Part of the reason for the continuing challenge and efforts that we have for African American social justice and liberation in America, and the Pan-African situation toward liberation in Africa and the Caribbean and other parts of the world, is that part of our problems have been caused by this distinct historical burden and cross that we all bear, and the world bears, humanity bears. It's based upon basically the racism, the exploitation, and the colonialism that's been visited upon African people and other people around the world. And so while we talk about strategy for urban development, I think for me that must be a context that just has to frame. So if sometimes my passion overtakes me, please understand it's from a sense of urgency that I have, and that, and let me refer here to a scholar, Ali Missouri, and I've mentioned this before, but he talked about 4 great revolutions of the 20th century. The first great revolution being a more morally accountable economic system, symbolized by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, Social Security, laws against child labor, that whole effort toward a more morally accountable and responsible economic system. Second great revolution of the 20th century in the 60s, the movement toward African independence, the anti-colonialism response for the Caribbean, the civil rights movement in the United States. Third great revolution was the Green Revolution, not money so much but more ecology. So you had this country being very much concerned about clean water, clean air, fighting industrial pollution. Fourth great revolution he identified was the gender revolution, the empowerment of women and the representation of women in key places. He suggests, and I agree, that we're in the midst of the 5th great revolution of the 20th century. Here at 1999, as we stand poised for the new millennium, the 21st century, we're in the middle of the 5th great revolution, and it's a counter-revolution to undo the first 4. Now, if, as I believe, the real key to African independence and self-determination, economic stability, and African American social justice, equitable representation, is that we are the keys to each other. That if the African American community cannot link up with the African community, provide our technical skills, the wealth that we have as consumers and in some cases business people, if we can't get intimately involved and deeply involved with the African economy as developers, as business people, as importers, as exporters, then I don't think either one of our populations will ever resolve and get out of this situation where we're basically a subjected culture of people dominated by other interests outside of our own communities or outside of our own countries. So with that context, understand that we don't have all the answers. Let me go to some ideas that I think in terms of how this is developed, not only in Africa but around the world. As I understand my superficial reading or maybe understanding of human society and development, basically we all started in various tribal relationships with the same basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter, basically living in an agrarian economy. Over the course of time, we saw the political development of nations out of those tribal systems to feudal, colonial, semi-independent status, and then independent status, moving slowly but surely from a rural, agrarian-based economy to a more industrial-based economy. That meant that people were naturally drawn to what ultimately became urban centers, later cities. And when these great numbers of people gathered in one place, it began to be kind of obvious, I think, universally across human civilization, that there were certain assets that made cities more livable and economically viable. Clearly, there was a need for an infrastructure. One of the things that were responsible for the Great Plague in Europe was the lack of a clean water and sewer system, the need for transportation networks so that people can move around efficiently and effectively, the identification and maintenance of safe, clean water sources, an efficient system for the development of and removal of solid waste, and now in today's time, a sound energy system, a power system. Then as we look for making cities somewhat viable, then we try to make them livable. The need for housing, in particular the housing for low and moderate income families. We see, particularly in modern times, the need to have mixed income communities, because we found, quite frankly, that whenever you simply had populations of just the poor, it exacerbated other negative conditions. We found that we needed green space because people who are marginalized by income, don't have many of those recreational resources and green space alternatives that other people of better means, economic means have. We found that we needed to have a quality public education system where there was some means for the development and training of the larger population. And we saw that we really needed to deal with health care delivery. And here at this point, I mentioned HIV and AIDS. And that's because as I've studied history, two things have struck me that were consistent with the attack and the overwhelming of indigenous populations. And that is the advantage that advanced technology played and health issues played. And so when we see Cortez moving into South and Central America, we see him moving with swords of iron against wooden spears and wooden sticks. So the technology overwhelmed the local population. Then they brought with them their immunity from the diseases that they'd overcome from the Great Plague, which completely wiped out the indigenous populations in the lower Americas, the native population of the Incas. And now we see part of that same challenge today. We see in both African populations in America and African populations in Africa, we basically, most of us don't know how to spell internet. We're completely left out of this technological revolution, evolution that's sweeping the world, and thereby, I think, increasing the great economic and social and educational disadvantage of that marginalized population. At the same time, we see this dramatic increase with HIV infection. According to information that I received from Washington, from congressional offices, 22 million people in Africa alone are infected with HIV. So again, the sense of urgency that I have is the sense of seeing a crisis of genocidal proportions upon us, even though here we are African people in America, best trained, best educated, wealthiest population, freest population, and in Africa, people with the greatest assets of natural wealth in terms of natural resources, wholly unable to control and really benefit from that collectively as a people. And what that means in today's reality of scarce resources in the midst of us, neither of our populations and communities controlling our own destinies. With these large urban populations, we now see also a need for effective telecommunications. And probably had it not been for the development and use of the cellular telephone and the pager system, the telecommunications system in Africa would be wholly inadequate to respond to the kinds of opportunities and challenges that exist today. Because otherwise they could not serve the business-to-business needs as well as residential customer needs. We see mass media communications not fully being developed in Africa, but becoming the dominant reality in America. So clearly, as these challenges of managing these economies, dealing with these questions of governance and distribution of wealth, influence, and power, clearly mass media communications is a necessary asset of a livable great city. State-of-the-art computer technology. We simply cannot compete using secondary technology. We're on typewriters and everybody else is on computers. We simply cannot be competitive in today's market, which requires, I think, a degree of competitiveness and quality of services, regardless of what community or country or background that you have. I've also become kind of increasingly aware of the need to pay attention to culture, to art, to the values that hold and bind the people together, that express essentially who they are. You know, in America at this time, it's kind of the best of times and the worst of times. We are indeed, so it is said, the wealthiest, most powerful country on earth. Yet we have a culture in which, in many times, in many ways, seems to be self-destructing. And so on the day that some 700 international delegates from all over the world are gathered in Houston to talk about energy, to talk about development, to talk about international business and trade, here the Americans and people in Houston who are hosting that are concerned and troubled in that children are killing children, leaving 30 pipe bombs in one high school, 2 kids, not even cross-race, of the same race, 2 young white youngsters who felt isolated and ostracized from their own community and population, and they go and have murdered some 16 children and 4 or 5 other adults, and left 30 pipe bombs in that school, knowledge that they gained from the internet and carried out. And then just as that news begins to emerge here in our own state of Texas, a plot for a similar event among other high school students. So there's something about our culture, something about our values, something about what we're about now in America that says to me that perhaps one of the enduring assets of Africa is that it did have such a strong culturally based background of values and family and extended family that seemed to bind it together even in the midst of the crises of political and economic exploitation. There are some assets that we have in Houston that we have been fortunate enough to take advantage of. The physical facilities. Houston was blessed to be in a place where there's a natural water supply, clean water supply. We have the National Aeronautical and Space Administration housed here, the Space Center for all the world, the largest medical center in the world, the Texas Medical Center. We are the energy capital of the world. Virtually every major oil and energy company is somehow headquartered or represented in Houston. We have a solid educational system. We have a very, very strong college and university system. We have a good and getting better public school education system. And perhaps even more important, we have a strong community college system to provide training and semi-skilled training for semi-skilled workers. And we're essentially a community of villages. And so even though we have a very diverse population, it is a population that still maintains some homogenous aspects to itself, so that you can identify some of the Chinese community, you can identify the Latino community, you can identify mixed communities. And so there's some clear communal identification by various communities that is not in conflict, but is one of cultural pride. We have a very strong tax base in the city of Houston because of our diversified economy. Back in the late 70s and early 80s, when the price of real estate collapsed and oil collapsed, the economy of the city of Houston was virtually in a wreck, and for many years, some 5, 6, 7 years, it took us to climb out of that situation. One of the things that public policy officials did was to make moves to encourage and stimulate diverse sectors of the economy, to diversify the economy. So when the price of oil dropped a month or so ago, significantly so, and stayed there for a while in the cellar, Houston's economy remained strong, remained vibrant. We've been dealing with an annual growth rate of our own tax base, about 4.5% to 5%. Our city budget is $2.2 billion. And of that $2.2 billion, we are mandated by city charter to maintain 5% on reserve. We have 7% on reserve. Money is not the biggest challenge and problem we have in Houston right now. As a matter of fact, Houston has the most powerful urban economy of any city in the country. One of those reasons is that we have the best quality of life for the least cost of living. People in other major cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles are often just shocked and amazed that for the kind of income that they're used to having, they can live a much better lifestyle in a much better neighborhood. Some key decisions that were part of, I think, the success of Houston now, and part of that urban growth, was a decision by city leaders some years ago, it may have been 50, 60 years ago, to build a ship channel connecting the Gulf of Mexico to the Port of Houston. That did several things. It basically wiped out Galveston as competition to Houston as a port city, but it laid a new economic base which is built and become the largest port in some, or second largest port in other areas with regard to international trade through seaborne trade in Houston. Second, we realized that there have been various stages of Houston's success as well as Texas with regard to growth and economic development. Back during the 1800s, the first spike in the state economy and Houston economy was cotton. Cotton was king, and we became a major distribution point for cotton. Then secondly, after cotton phased out, the next great spike was cattle. Houston was on a key transit link north and south to take cattle on up the trail toward Kansas and ultimately up to Chicago. After cotton, then technology. And so Houston became a technology corridor benefiting from the placement of NASA in the area. Now as we move to the 21st century, most of us think that our greatest asset will be human resources, human talent, human skills. The fact that we have a young population, a well-educated population, makes us extremely attractive for new industrial and manufacturing centers to move into this city. And so now we're investing much more into education and educational facilities to make sure we help grow that human asset. One of our philanthropists donated some land, maybe 75 years ago, to what ultimately became the Texas Medical Center, the largest world-renowned medical facility in the world. We created a lot of public space for parks. I did not realize, I expected probably when I was on the first elected city council that the most controversial issue would be the police department, had been. But what people fiercely fight for in their neighborhoods is green space and parks and protection of trees. And so we're fortunate that some of the earlier public policy leaders began to establish that, but parks remains to be an increasingly important part of this city's success, growth, and development. And as I said earlier, we diversified our economy into medical research, space technology, and computer technology to prevent dependence upon one industry and to, in fact, talk about safeguarding our economic viability. Another sound decision we made not too many years ago was to rebuild Houston's aging infrastructure. Part of it was mandated not so much by foresight on our part, but by an EPA mandate that said that you have to rebuild your water and sewer system. Because of the strength of the economy, we were able to sell bonds, and we now have the best water and sewer system in the country that will last us 40 years into the future. We're expanding our airport, in fact doing $1.4 billion worth of airport expansion improvements throughout our entire airport system. We're improving our transportation networks. Houston is fortunate not only to be a leader in seaborne trade to the Port of Houston, as well as in terms of aviation, being the 4th largest city in the country and probably close to the 3rd largest airport system. But we have been designated part of the Interstate 69 corridor, which will link up Canada, North America, Mexico, and on into Latin America, which will create us as a major distribution point and transit point from north to south, making this an extremely critical point in terms of distribution of goods and services throughout not only the United States, but in terms of international trade to the rest of the world. It's my hope, working on the International Trade Committee, and us already being as a city a gateway to Africa, that we can be a major transit point for east and west access for goods and services, as Los Angeles has become for the Pacific Rim. And we continue to identify financial resources to address increasing demands on the city. Public policy is not only designed to respond to the perceptions of people, but also to look forward to create the kind of environment that people want to live in, and that they have to feel safe and secure, and they must have clean, decent housing to live in. One of the things that we addressed was law enforcement, and increasing law enforcement to deal with the perception or reality of the increase in crime that we had some years ago. Our crime rate has been increasing dramatically over the course of the last 8 or 9 years. And one of the things that was done, because it takes a while to recruit new officers to build up the level of your force, during the economic decline, we not brought in new officers and had new training classes for our cadets. But what we did was we took some money that had been designated for rail, and put that money into transportation and freed up some money and started hiring officers on overtime. And so although we had one person, we had the equivalent of 1.5 times more officers, because we put more time of those officers on the street, and we were able to increase the number of police time and officers available by 600 full-time employees. Later on, we were able to wean ourselves off the overtime program and recruit more officers and increase the size of our force. We developed our inner city downtown core. One of the things that you've seen in America, and particularly in some of the major northern cities, I think Detroit comes to mind, some parts of some other major cities come to mind, particularly on the East Coast, is that the inner city core has basically declined. There is no major shopping area downtown. Houston has a number of multiple financial, economic, and retail and shopping outlets, but we felt that we needed to make an investment in downtown Houston, and so we, through the city government, began to fund various projects, our cultural and theater district, our convention center, a downtown convention center hotel, a brand new baseball stadium, a major retail and commercial center. With the result is that we are now building new skyscrapers downtown. The occupancy rate of major office complex downtown has increased dramatically, and we now have a vibrant inner city core. Another part of that also was improving inner city neighborhoods, and so we developed 2 public policy initiatives to deal with that. One was neighborhood to standards, and the other was parks to standards. And so we, as a city government, put in millions of dollars into bringing inner city neighborhoods up to a certain level of standard with street lights, sidewalks, paved streets, improvements to parks, and so it made it attractive for people not just to move into the suburbs, but also that they could have a livable quality of life in the inner city. The other thing we did is we developed a program for first-time home buyers in which we gave grants of $3,500 for existing housing or $5,000 for new housing, new construction, to first-time home buyers. These are grants, and we require those families to live in those houses for at least 7 years before they could be sold, because we wanted to try to increase home ownership. And so what we found is after 3 years of that program being very successfully, there's as much building, if not more, going on inside the inner city, inside the loop, than was going on in suburban areas. So we've been very successful in that regard. I believe that when we look at Africa, that we have to understand that urban revitalization for cities in Africa is part of a liberation movement, part of the liberation struggle with Africa. And it means that we've got to address social, political, economic, and development issues. That means that I think it's important that we have democratic governance. I think we've got to deal with the monopolization of economic and political power, both internal and external. I think that there's got to be a realization that there's a globalization of the economy. Africa in itself and African communities and governments cannot and must not be isolated from the rest of the world. That somehow we've got to maintain our cultural ties and our cultural heritage while mitigating what appears to be this desire to accept everything from the West. I went to Africa and found that I had more African cultural clothing and ideas than some of the people that I was meeting with. And I cautioned some of my hosts to remember that not everything in the West is good. I am a member of the National Forum for Black Public Administrators, and we've discussed this idea before, and I've discussed it with certain officials. In virtually every sector of government and private business are African Americans and others, but certainly African Americans with skills in finance administration, skills with regard to how to pave roads, management strategies and tactics, human resources, complex financial schemes, tourism, convention bureau, in every aspect, law enforcement, aviation. African Americans are well placed and in strategic positions. It seems to me that there may be a way, that it might be of some value, that during their vacation, I'm thinking of a non-government sponsored, at least non-U.S. government sponsored program, take their 2-week vacation, transportation be provided for them to go to Africa, and while they're in Africa, they could meet with their counterparts and offer free expertise 3 or 4 hours a day, get a cultural international experience by being in another country, and bring back some broadening and depth from the experience to our city there, and vice versa. So basically, for the cost of an airline ticket and some housing, we might be able to get some very high levels of expertise and technical skills in an exchange program that African people could organize and control. There are some different methods of analyzing and strategizing around some of the challenges that we have in our cities, and I imagine Miguel will talk about this in greater depth. I do a lot of strategic planning and kind of situational audits of what's up analysis, strengths, weaknesses versus threats and opportunities, thereby identifying priorities and moving along with a strategic plan to move kind of up the pyramid to achieve ultimate objectives. But there's also, I think, the opportunity for asset-based management, looking at those things which are positives, assets that can be utilized to build upon and thereby not simply look at what we need, but look at what we have. Second, I think, as I was talking to one African leader about the need for transportation, good roadways to bring goods and services to the city and for distribution. He said, you know, we might not want to encourage all the African rural population to move to the cities because there are no jobs. And that's what I mean about this kind of mirror reflection, that everything that we might think of as an idea or strategy would be the best one to employ. Utilizing certain financial structures and schemes that may be appropriate that we've developed. In this city, of course, we use tax increment reinvestment zones that allow us to stimulate economic development by using public funds for public improvements, but thereby encouraging and stimulating private sector growth. tax abatements, which is probably something that is used fairly widely in Africa today. Ecotourism opportunities. I do not think that many of the African nations has fully utilized the opportunities to bring in other dollars from other places other than their own indigenous population by taking advantage of all of their tourist assets. I was simply stunned at the beauty of the continent on the 2 times that I went there, as well as the history of the continent, and I know that were we able to create the kind of tourist base of assets in terms of hotel, travel, amenities, and so forth, there would be a lot more dollars that would flow from the United States to Africa. Marketing. I have kind of reinforced again and again and again that the African nations must market themselves and their assets, because there is indeed a negative, false, wrongly, I think, promoted stereotype of what Africa is and what Africa can be. The imagery that we see of Africa consistently and constantly is an image of starving, hungry people begging for some aid or some assistance, almost ignoring completely that there are many urban major cities that are much like our own. And that there's many parts of Africa that's a very, very diverse nation in many ways, operating and maintaining a very efficient and effective system of governance. And so they need to make assiduous efforts to correct that distorted international image. It's interesting that in the Caribbean it's good with this, because they will come to Jamaica and they will show these beautiful pictures of this environment and this beauty and these halfly clothed women. You know, we pick up and go down and give up our money on the gambling ship and the casinos in the Caribbean, but we're not aware of the beauty and power of Sun City in South Africa. And again, I continue because I think it's important to emphasize the need to deal with HIV and AIDS. We also have, because this is the largest medical center in the world, we have a very extraordinary healthcare delivery system, able to bring some of our assets related to HIV and AIDS treatment from Houston, and we're interested in taking that to Africa. We're interested in using sister city relationships with countries to develop, I think, opportunities for exchanges in that regard. I think it's important that we continue to build upon educational exchange programs, school-to-school programs. We've been looking with the Houston Independent School District at a school-to-school program via the internet with the schools in Malawi. Interestingly, I was watching a documentary and looking at the libraries in Africa with virtually no books of any kind in any area, and we throw books away in the United States. We give books away. We sell books at half their value and price. Because this is such a media-dominated culture, we've got to find a way not to waste the assets that we give away in America and provide those assets to emerging countries and nations so that they can take advantage of them. And dual citizenship. There are some of us who feel deeply tied to and in love with. I describe myself as hopelessly in love with African people, unconditional and undying, and am very much interested in regaining my cultural heritage and ties. And I know that the nation of Ghana has explored these ideas of dual citizenship, and I think it's one that ought to be on the agenda of the Organization of African Unity for pursuit and consideration of. But these are just some thoughts and ideas of mine that I hope to frame the discussion. I want to pause now, and I'd like to invite at this point some of our guests who are on the resource panel from EDI Architects, because I know of your work and am very excited about the fact that the nation of Angola has retained your firm to do some master planning of communities in Angola. And with the kind of experience that you have, I think you may be able to elaborate, and please, as we say in the movement, rescue me if I'm wrong. So if I said anything that appears to you to be incorrect or not on target, please say so, because this is kind of a collective search for enlightenment. Thank you very much.
We believe that, most of the things that Councilman Don Boney mentioned today are essential in the revitalization of cities. We believe that strong interchange of, let's say, past experience can bring a lot of good to African countries. We have been involved in development in Angola since 1992. and have helped trying to make some of those ideals a reality out in Angola. And it has been hard work for us, our company, and a lot of commitment of time and efforts, being away from families and all of that. But ultimately, the goals of achieving a better lifestyle, a better place for people, really is what we're, after, at the end of the day. Dennis has been extremely involved in the making of all of those dreams out in Angola and Luanda, and some other also areas of Angola, and I'll let him kind of expand on that. Dennis, you want to add to that?
Thank you. Thank you, Councilman Boney. To just pick up on a few of the points that you made, you are absolutely spot on, and you're a pretty tough guy to follow. You're well-informed, well-traveled, and obviously well-educated. But going back to your outline, which is very well put together, for example, in Angola, where you talk about things that happened in Houston and what we learned and how we can apply them, I want to go back and make some references to what actually took place. Strong infrastructure, for example. We found that in the project, one of the projects that we were working on in Angola, that the infrastructure actually became the key to the success of that particular development. The reason being was, basically, when we got there, we found out that water was going to be the making or breaking of this particular job. We could build roads, we could build storm drainage, we could study the hydrology, we could save the vegetation that was there. The whole ideas of good planning for this particular development was that what we saw a lot was a lot of the development that took place was a result of oil and gas companies that were moving into Africa. As you may or may not know, the west coast of Africa has become the new oil and gas gold rush of the world. The discoveries that have taken place in West Africa are phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. I think the largest discoveries in the Western Hemisphere today have taken place by ELF, Exxon, British Petroleum, Amoco, which are, of course, now the same. Chevron, just incredible discoveries of reserves of larger than all of Saudi Arabia. So therefore, they have this big, giant need for families, for schools, for medical facilities, recreational facilities, and so forth. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to force livable communities. And we kept saying to them, don't build a community, fly these people over here, put them on rotation, make them bachelor communities, and put walls up around them. Why don't you build communities where you take a part of the community, that you live next to Angolans, Angolans live next to you. Why doesn't the community take responsibility for security? Why don't you create community associations? Let's pull down the walls, in a sense, and push back up the livability of the communities. All the houses were designed with a street front emphasis, where porches were in the front of the house. And we found out that, you talk about the good and the bad, and we need to leave some of our bad at home, take some of our good over there, learn from some of their good. One of the things that's real true of African people are incredible people. They're nice. They are very educated. They're very outgoing, very family-oriented. African people probably have better family values than we've let some of ours decay to, and that's so encouraging to see that. So therefore, they're perfect for livable communities. Going back to the strong infrastructure, basically when we researched the actual water line coming from the main water supply in this particular city, that we could see that by the time it actually got built, that they were building a big, beautiful line, big steel conduit underground with large cisterns that basically stored the water. The water came from a very large freshwater river. It was recharged from this river. But the problem is, they put all this money into the line and the storage facility and the transfer plant, but they forgot how the water got from, they didn't forget, there wasn't funds available to improve the actual water into the existing storage facility. So you could see that there was going to be a major problem, because this was at the end of the line, that there wouldn't be enough water. So we put a massive program together. We brought in hydrologists from South Africa. We found a hydrologist that specialized in hydrology studies. And we came in and did a viability study as to whether or not there was an aquifer that was basically there. And the interesting thing is there's an incredible aquifer that goes from the western side of Africa all the way down. The oil and gas industry basically drills right through the aquifer. So when they do log bearings to actually go for oil, they're going down 600 meters. The aquifers are at 200 meters. And basically what we did is we took all the oil and gas data that we were able to get from FINA and a couple of the different groups, and we found that everybody had just written the aquifer off. They said it was brackish. Otherwise, it had outcropped to the ocean. Therefore, salt water was coming in. Well, the truth of the matter was that it was brackish in that particular area, but there was an incredible aquifer. So what we did was back up on the hill through the hydrologist and found a secondary source of water, and then the whole water system for this particular community was basically designed when the public infrastructure failed. But by putting that secondary water system in and putting it into the program, this community is now going forward. The Africans that are in Angola are the ones that had the foresight to see this community and to pull down the security elements and to not make it another camp, which we see so much happening over there. Companies go in and they don't want to mingle with the locals, and they're concerned about bringing families over. But that's all changing. African countries are demanding that we, as visitors in their country, start to develop their infrastructure. And so good things are happening. And there are some examples of it that go back and highlight some of the things that were in your outline.
Did the government of Angola approach you, or did you approach Angola? How did that whole relationship develop?
The first time we went to Angola in 1991, we were invited by the National Oil Company of Angola to look at a very quick fix to repair a series of bridges that had been blown up because the Pope was visiting Angola. And basically, they didn't know the itinerary of the Pope at the time. But it was viewed that the Pope would actually land in Angola, give a big open mass, fly to Soyo, which is on the mouth of the Zaire River, just below, at the time, what used to be Zaire, and then drive from Soyo, basically following the river, the river bed of Zaire, into a city called Mbanza Congo. And the reason that this was very important was Mbanza Congo was the first Catholic church in all of Africa, as I understand, or this region. I hope I don't have it wrong. I'm watching some of the good folks here, making sure that I'm not saying things wrong. But anyways, Mbanza Congo was where they were going to have a big mass, and he was going to drive in. There are basically about 11,000 lineal miles of roads in Angola, and about 3,000 bridges. Unfortunately, all these roads and most of these bridges got blown up during their civil strife that is still currently taking place today. And hopefully they're finding a solution to the end of it. But the idea was to put these 3 bridges back in place so he could drive through. But in the end, it was decided that he would fly, because they couldn't guarantee the safety. And so that's the first job that we did. The second job was an actual office development that was funded by some private investors from Japan and the United States. And then the third job was looking at a palace that was built. There was a lot of problems with it and so forth. And then we currently today are working on hospitals. And Sonangol, the national oil company of Angola, and the government of Angola have been some of our prime clients down there. We saw a big void. We saw a lot of oil and gas companies going there. We went there and opened up an office, learned the laws, became registered, and said, why shouldn't an American architect and planning firm be in Africa? But I hope that we're, you know, one of the things we always tell our employees before they go down there is, remember, we're visitors. Because a lot of Western people, you made a point that I think was really well put. A lot of Western people think that we know it all, and we should go down there and pose our thoughts. Well, I think we ought to go down there and remember what we learned and leave our ears open, and remember that we're visitors, because you know, they have a lot to offer us as well, a great deal to offer us. But and they had strong communities before colonialism. They had incredible communities. It's colonialism that really set the Africans back, I believe, to a large extent. I mean, we've raped Mother Africa as economic powers, and now we have a role to play, I think.
This may be difficult to respond, and I don't want, you may want to hop in here too, Miguel, because I want to come to you next to talk about what things that you've seen, particularly since you've also been involved in some of these same challenges in Latin America. But is it, let me put it this way, flip it. I've often found public officials in American government who don't seem to have a tremendous amount of vision and foresight in terms of development of communities. I think, for example, many of the policies that were enacted during the Reagan-Bush years, the disinvestment in cities, the robbing of funds for health care and for public education, the sense of separating government from responding to social service needs in the 80s, I think created some of the crises that we're dealing with in the 90s. Is it your sense that, not in Angola particularly, but generally, that African governments are as aware as they could be about using some of the funds that are being generated from this new investment, particularly, I guess, along the West Coast, and the need to take full advantage of that opportunity while it lasts to deal with some of the social human needs as they are? I remember looking at some documentary struggles with the Ogoni people in Shell, and so while Shell was doing pretty good, and certain other aspects, the Ogoni community had some real issues that developed out of the Shell investment and development in Nigeria.
You know, they're paying taxation on barrelage. That taxation, they hope, is being plowed back into the community, into social programs. A lot of the American corporations have played a big role in social projects. They have large social projects that they sponsor. The Americans have a little bit of a different rule to follow. A lot of the French, a lot of, and I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, don't have to follow the same trade practices that we do. Mm-hmm. And they can actually use funds that can fund individuals as a means of securing a contract. Mm-hmm. The Italians have that, the French have it, the Swiss have it, and whilst Americans, our foreign corrupt trade practices prohibit us from doing that in a big way, to the point that we as directors of corporations, if we get involved in that stuff, can go to jail. So what do Americans do? Well, they try to put programs together for social projects, to build schools and so forth. So you're seeing some of it, obviously not enough. I think that you have to start somewhere. I think the other thing is, too, that a lot of the African governments, they're coming out of turmoil or they're still in turmoil, have really poor fiscal policies. And so it's hard for them to be organized and to apply funds to various things. But you know, they are doing better. I think the programs that the World Bank has, you know, I hope that the IMF gets more involved in Africa as it is now. That'll make a big difference because, you know, at the end of the day, all of our companies are down there bringing a lot of profits home. So we do have a role to play.
Let me turn to Steve Tinneman, who's with the City of Houston Planning Department, and Miguel Garcia. Miguel, I know you brought some particular ideas that you wanted to share. In our early discussions, one of the things that was particularly interesting to me was you being able to see parallels between issues and challenges in Africa and other emerging nations with issues and challenges in Latin America and South America, and how those could be applied.
After discussing quite a bit of the preparation materials with the councilman, it became evident to me that I'm seeing similar patterns in Africa as I've seen in Latin America. Namely, the rush into very sensitive ecosystems like the Amazon Basin in South America by petrochemical companies for exploration and production, but leaving behind very little in its place with respect to investment in the local economy and also in the local ecosystem. That characterized Latin America for about 20-25 years until a series of events occurred that basically brought indigenous people from the Amazon Basin to sue people like Texaco here in Houston and gain multi-billion-dollar awards against them for contamination issues. I think the industry and the host nations down there have learned quite a bit in that you have to balance the economic development component with natural resource exploration production with quality of life issues. Very important. Out of that, I believe, has come this whole movement called sustainable development that we'll talk about in a few moments, so to speak. But in Latin America, what we're seeing now as a response to that, council member, and to the panel, is innovations with respect to financing. Mechanisms like debt for nature swaps, wherein as oil companies go in and essentially are allowed to explore with the idea of developing natural parks, ecosystem maintenance, buying up some of the international debt of these host countries, and in return maintaining sanctuaries for indigenous people and also for natural resources. We're also seeing, as you mentioned earlier, a big shift in countries like Costa Rica to ecotourism. A big part of their economy now has become ecotourism. In fact, I'm going down there in a couple of weeks to talk about putting solar-powered cells in some of their national parks, because as well as they are marketing themselves for ecotourism, and when you go to their national parks, I know Antonio has been down in Central America quite a bit, you're from there, you'll see big PCB transformers with overhead utility lines that look like part of our inner cities. It sends the wrong message to tourists. But needless to say, I think in Latin America we're seeing a response. We're seeing some strategies.
Mean what?
Ecotourism. Ecotourism really focuses on preserving the natural ecosystem, natural resources, the flora and the fauna of a community, so that tourists, whether it be within the country or from outside the country, could come and experience that. You'd be very surprised that in capitals like Santiago, Chile, where air quality is worse than Houston's, Mexico City, where we all know air quality is worse than Houston, how much people want to get out of the city and go for some time to understand nature. Tremendous amount of dollars are being spent in places like the Manu National Park in the Amazon Basin of Peru with tours. A lot of money is being spent in Costa Rica. And from what I understand, in a lot of East African countries, that is also part of a phenomena starting to occur right now as well, with looking at the wildlife and some of these photo safari phenomena I'm hearing about. It's not the only answer, but it is a response towards balancing between natural resource exploration and production versus maintaining the ecosystem of a particular very delicate nation at this point. So those are some observations I see from Latin America from this perspective, and I think they run somewhat parallel, although each country has its own unique challenges and opportunities and unique group of players that are involved. If you look at, for instance, in Peru, Texaco is very big in Peru. They're not as big as in Colombia. Colombia, you have BP, and you have all the problems we're hearing about in Colombia with rebels trying to fight for land reform versus paramilitary groups versus the government groups versus the oil exploration companies. That is a very interesting milieu, mix of dynamics to do business in. And in fact, when I do go down there, fortunately, I get paid hazard pay because it's a very challenging environment to work in. But out of that crisis, out of that miscommunication, I'm fairly optimistic that resolutions are only a small refinement away to making things happen. If there was not that kind of interest by multiple parties in that same economy, in that same environment, then I would say that there is no asset, as you mentioned, to basically mine, to actually pursue. So I am cautiously optimistic in places like Colombia and places like Ecuador, where we're having some difficult times in Latin America. There is opportunity that can be pursued, and hopefully some of the conflicts can be resolved.
This is the way I see it now. Here we are professionals of some degree or another. I think with at least a sense of a moral compass and a progressive consciousness. We want to do good work, and we want to transform communities into better communities. And here we have these urban populations in emerging countries, and I'm particularly focused on Africa. Now, we have some people from Africa in our audience, and you may have some questions, but here we have the realities that you face in these urban cities with limited, scarce resources, human populations that have expectations of social transformation yesterday. And you have many of the dollars for investment and development being foreign dollars that are basically profit-driven. And here we are as professionals trying to say, okay, this is what we learned over here that we like to try to move over here. We need a reality check in terms of those of you who go in and out of Africa and live in Africa. How and what do you think we could do to help, or what questions would you raise based upon this framework that we've set? Because I think that we have to make some good and clear decisions now, because I think missteps now, or mistakes now, or lack of action now is going to cost decades of more casualties, not just a year or two slowdown in the project.
Has there been any attempt to ask communities what they want?
Go ahead.
I think that you're all bringing up sensitive subjects that are existing in Africa. However, I think some really good things are happening regarding these problems. They are definitely roadblocks to the communities in large in Africa. And I believe the people in Africa are forcing the change more than anything we're doing. I really do believe that. For example, the new generation that's coming up in Africa, the new kids that are taking leadership roles and becoming active in government and are becoming assistant directors and vice directors of various departments and various ministries are having to report to their own, in a sense. So they're forcing companies to get involved in social projects. Your comment about should we go to the people, the only way you can really, let's take an example of a contract for a large company, production sharing agreement that your countries use. You've all retained a number of lawyers to advise you on how to write production sharing agreements, correct? Where you own the resources and you invest partially in the development of those resources, which has a tax base. And then there is an operator's agreement that goes along in conjunction with that production sharing agreement. I believe your production sharing agreements are the first place that you could introduce the things you're talking about. So many dollars of every development should go into a social program, identified by you, monitored by a third party if you like, if you're concerned about an American company say, well, but we need to monitor that. You know, that production sharing agreement is probably the strongest thing you have, which is your resources. Another way of doing it, for example, there's just been a new tax base that has been created in Angola, where we as a company there now have to pay 6% in advance of every contract that we have in the country. That's a great thing. Think of all the years that those companies did not pay 6%. Once again, there is the place where that form could be created. I don't know if I've answered the question, but you know, I don't know that we can do it from our
I'm
end.
not saying, I said because his question is that the government is corrupt, right? And so that you have to, as somebody wanting to do good, as a company wanting to do good, the company that is setting up the rules that you're playing in isn't looking out for the community, but you as a good global citizen, you know that already when you go in. You know that. So what do you trying to prevent yourself from seeing from what is happening to Shell in Nigeria? If Shell did everything by the book, but it still did not give the Boney people anything.
Yes.
But trying to be a good corporate citizen of the world, you pulled out of not within the rules. I said, look, I do this. I'm making lots of money out of this community. What can I do for these people outside what the government had asked me to do?
This is kind of a twofold question, and it's not nearly as simple as it may be. First of all, as someone who is a public official elected in the United States, I would not like the false impression to be given to the country or the world that we're all saints and angels here. There is unfortunately more than enough corruption in the United States, and I'm not sure that there's any less than there is in any country around the world. So I don't want that impression to go forward that we do everything by the book and right. I wish we did, but we don't. We may be somewhat more adept at cloaking and and putting it in disguise, and it might be not as overt and on the table. It may manifest itself in other kind of contractual arrangements that have the appearance of propriety and legality, but are as wholly corrupt as others. Secondly, I don't want people to believe that most public officials are corrupt, either in Africa or the United States. I think it's quite surprising that often, many times, I think more often than not, something takes hold of the person when you get the office. Whatever might have been your intention or your ignorance when you got in that position, there's something about the burden of responsibility one feels when you are in the position or seat of authority and people cry out to you out of need and out of hurt that happens to a chief of police or a mayor or a governor or a president or a senator. And what hurts many of us much more than I think people realize is when we find ourselves unable to respond to those human felt needs of those populations. But there are two other pieces to this that are, I think, both systemic and establishment. And we talked about this in the conference room the other day, Miguel, is that it's this issue of accountability and this issue of the people. Many times we find corruption tends to grow and fester where the people are not and light is not. And so if you don't have an organically connected mass base and any small group of people trying to either hold power, authority, and make decisions, it is inherently incestuous and corrupting. That the way that you gain this kind of accountability and this level of security is to have the masses of people involved in decision making, in governance, in review, and in response. There is a self-seductive idea, I think, for people in positions of power and leadership, is that they have the correct information, that by virtue of their training, their degrees, or their experience, that somehow they got it, the people don't. Otherwise, why would they be there and the people be down there? And I think that's a dialectic that we have to fight. And that one of the things that Miguel said to me in our pre-meeting is that these communities have ideas of solution on their own. What they often don't have is resources to apply for the solution. We say in the movement that the people have the answer. Listen to the people, study from the people, respond for the people. The people are not stupid. But they may not know or they may not have access to the tools and resources to identify. Many times they are wiser than we are. The second part is this cycle of instability that comes from these natural tensions and pressures by virtue of the history and baggage we bring. By that I mean that someone came to power because of a backdoor political move or an assassination or some other thing that is quote-unquote non-democratic. Well, that person guides or rules or governs for a while, and then, it happens again. And these cycles keep repeating themselves, and somehow this cycle has to be an ever upward spiral and not an ever descending spiral where we do the same old thing over and over again. And so it is very difficult, I will tell you, from a protocol sense, from a security sense, from an intellectual sense, and from a business sense, for anybody from the outside to come in and say, well, you really ought to do it this way. Even if we really believe that it ought to be done that way, or if you go in and you're talking to a public official about a business, because the only reason you're there is for a business opportunity. This is not a humanitarian program here. This conference is about economics. Now, politics and economics are intertwined, and you would hope there'd be some humanity and morality along with it, but whether you keep a job or not, or your company stays in business or not, is can you bring some measurable bottom line accountability back home with you? And so if you then stray out of, what is the accepted path, and so, well, let me go meet with the people and find out what the people want. The people in positions of authority and power will very soon let you know that you have violated protocol, and your business gets harder to do as opposed to easier to do. And Miguel, I want you to kind of elaborate, because we talked about what you saw in Latin America and see, sometimes this is not just internal pressures on leadership, but external pressures as well, particularly in the emerging nations and the colonized nations.
One of the things that I think is strategic is that as companies from the West and North America and Europe go into Latin America, in my case, they know that they cannot afford political hiccups in their deals, okay? Namely the bombing of a pipeline, namely workforce strikes, namely some sort of embargo at the port to get their goods or services out to market. So they're increasingly turning to international humanitarian organizations, okay? Like the Organization for American States, which is the regional equivalent of the United Nations in Latin America, to bring together teams comprised of people like ourselves to work with local government officials, to work with the local foreign investment entity, with the local people there to create neighborhood plans, regional strategies from the bottom up, where individuals basically are already thinking about what is the best solution for this problem with respect to HIV. What is the best solution to the housing shortage for affordable homes? These people live and breathe in those communities 24/7. Who are we as consultants, as experts, to parachute in for a week or a month or even half a year to impose what works in Los Angeles, what works in London, what works in even places like Mexico City, to impose those kind of cookie-cutter approaches? So we listen. We listen quite a bit. And we're seeing some value added because we demonstrate to the firms that are investing that there's going to be minimal amount of upheaval that threatens their profits. This is part of the strategy of sustainability. Very important, because what does everybody want here? Okay? Everybody wants to see money generated, bottom line. What is the use of that money becomes the critical chip in the political game. Okay? And so if you develop a menu, a set of strategies for local residents and or stakeholders on the ground who are impacted by foreign investment, by perceived to be corrupt governments, that menu becomes a series of opportunities based upon their perspective of what should be done in that community. Then that menu goes out and gets funded. Okay? And I'll be talking about that further in a few minutes. That to me seems to be a new strategy, a new mindset of working in Latin America. I can't speak for Africa, but Latin America has had its share of corruption, assassinations, payoffs, backstabbing, upheavals. It still continues to do so in certain countries. But back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, it was not unheard of as seeing a new dictator in, let's say, Chile every other month.
I think that, the fact that Africans are in Houston, Houstons are in Africa, our company alone has invested dearly in Africa because we believe that there will be a reward for investing there. The more you can create atmospheres for American companies and other companies to invest in your country, you know, the better off. For example, if you've got a project that's coming up, say for example it's an infrastructure project, you do have projects all the time. Go outside of the beaten track. Make an international tender. Come right here to Houston, Texas and say, we require, in order for this job to go forward, that we want 2 engineering firms to bid on it. Force them engineering firms to follow particular standards. Say 10% of the value of the job has to go into a public school. Yeah, they're going to put it on top of the job, but you're going to get a school built and you're going to get another company involved that wasn't there before. Competition. Good business. And you talk a lot about the problems and Miguel was raising a lot of the very well put points with regards to corruption. The neat thing about Africa that they're all new democracies, and you have to get reelected. So, the people, the people in Africa are starting to make some real changes. The young people, the up-and-coming young people. You can't sit out there in the palace anymore and everybody think you have big giant bank accounts in Switzerland. I'm not saying that takes place, but you have to get reelected now. So you have to build communities, you have to build schools, you have to find ways of companies to invest. And the way to get companies and to invest is get more companies competing. Get more quality companies competing. Our company, as small as it is in Africa, we're not an oil and gas company, we encourage all these policies. For example, we push a program where we want our people that are down there to give free courses at the School of Architecture. And instead of them sitting in the staff house with nothing to do, we're saying you guys got to get out there and do that. We're forcing them into the community, and as a result, a lot of good things are happening. But what you see in Africa a lot is the same 4, the same 5. It's in Nigeria. You can count the major contractors on one hand. You can count the major consultants on one hand. You can take out an ad in the Houston Chronicle on your next bid. Force new blood into the system. Force new blood into your own system. Force us into. The more competition that takes place, the better. That's just one way of answering the question. I think it's true, to sit over here on this side and, like you say, come in for a week. Don't allow them to come in for a week. Make them have an office and give them tax advantages. Say you won't have to pay taxes for 3 years. The 6%. Give them ways of getting there, help them get there, force them to dance to a new drum, and it's kind of back and forth.
You raised a couple of things. Those are some practices that we do in Houston. I don't think it's law, but it certainly appears to be the dominant policy. We're not likely to award a contract to a company that does not even have an office in Houston. Doesn't make any sense when you've got Houston companies able to do everything. I think, secondly, that there is a paradigm shift and a policy shift that needs to occur with regard to Africa. One is that by virtue of the natural resource wealth that Africa has, it can dictate some better terms. And I think that it has not, because if you're on one side of the negotiating table and you believe that these are the only partners that want to dance with you, well, then you tend to give up a little bit more of the house. But if you realize that there's a great stereotype and ignorance of what's available, like he said, he knows more companies would come to Africa to do the work that he's doing. He's not going to necessarily bring them along with him because they would be competitors. But he knows, by virtue of his experience, that were it in his interest or were it a mandate, he would know how to bring others and get them involved. You must require the involvement of African and African-American people in this country. We have to increase the broad number of people of different kinds, I'm talking about people of African descent, in all of these areas, because there are things that we know about them and their companies, and we know about industry best practices, and that we know about negotiating or getting other kinds of involvement that you would know like I didn't know before I got here. You can't put pressure on your banker I can put pressure on your banker because he's not my banker. You can't go to where you're trying to get a loan and make a demand. And part of the other asset that the African countries have not utilized is, if you want to put pressure on the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the population of natural allies who are most able to do it is us. Because we don't borrow any money from the World Bank. The UN doesn't do much of anything too much for us. And so we don't care if they get angry. We don't care if they get mad. And we have some leverage and pressure points on them that could be utilized because some of their rates are almost usury. They come in and they dictate to your economy and say, yeah, we'll loan you some money, but you must do this, this, and this. In some cases that's good, in some cases that's bad. In some cases that's reform, and in other cases that's dictating to a country that might have another way. Somebody was telling me, I guess it might have been you, Miguel, I want to call on Fender. Oh no, it was Patrice, who said in his country they don't grow rice, but the international aid was just giving rice away and changing the consumer pattern where now these people who don't grow rice really want rice and like rice and love rice. Well, all of a sudden the free rice stops and now you can buy rice, you know. And now we're real clear about that because the way our society and community have been consumer manipulated so that we see it, we understand it. Doesn't take us 5 seconds to see that particular strategy and know that that's not good for us. But now if you hadn't seen that particular strategy before and you're not in a media manipulated, dominated society, you might find yourself all of a sudden nobody wants the yam anymore, which you can grow in the backyard. Everybody wants the rice, which you have to import and buy, and all that money moves out of the community. When you really begin to unravel this, you find that almost every constituent element is in a catch-22. The people are in a catch-22 because they're not in power and they have great, dramatic, immediate human needs. And by virtue of being part of the exploited mass base, first by the Europeans in colonialism, then by their surrogates in neo-colonialism, and to some degree as we began to transform into a more and more democratic society. I think it's important to understand that the democratic governments in Africa are less than 100 years old. The democratic government in the United States is over 200 years old. Well, about 100 years ago, we had a civil war, and there was great instability in this country. So I think we have to measure our evaluation or review of other governments in Latin America or Africa at least by the same standard as we've measured ourselves. Because the kind of division and self-strife that, more people died in the Civil War in this country than any other war that we've been involved in. And America has been involved in many killing and shooting wars. Is that more of these discussions, like the one that we tried to just introduce today, need to occur among the greatest number of us. And it needs to be ways in which we can institutionalize. And we need to thank Corporate Council of Africa for creating this kind of forum, because this is essentially a business conference for economic development. But a realization that economic development includes planning urban development, because for a corporation to be successful in Africa, they need to be involved in as much of a livable, sustainable community and city as possible, and that there's a self-interest involved for their investment toward that end. And that the people who have answers themselves, we all need to be empowering each other. And so where there's a conscious corporate global citizen, as he said, the people have supported that corporate's efforts for outreach. And the governments get it. Sometimes we don't get it the first time, but when we see the results, we want to take credit for it. We say, it was a good idea, and it was our idea too. And then we, as we can, as public officials or corporate citizens, empower the people and say, well, we're not going to try to take the place of the government, but we have a corporate obligation and a corporate policy of meeting with the community that we're going to be establishing a business with. It's just good business sense, so that all of our hands are on the table and everybody can see that our hands are clean. If there's accountability issues there with other sectors of the community and population. Miguel, let me ask you if you would just kind of wrap it up by going over some of the keys to urban development strategies, and then we'll close out.
Back in 1996, the Council for Urban Economic Development, which is a major trade association for those of us who practice economic development, issued a study, which I have copies of here to hand out if you're interested in, indicating that there was a series of challenges facing U.S. cities as they go into the 21st century. Those challenges are up there. I'll touch them briefly. First of all, jobs paying wages below levels to support families. People were employed, the economy was getting better, but people weren't being paid enough to support their families, so they became known as a working poor. Second of all, the lack of skilled, educated workforce. The idea of bringing them up to parity so they could take advantage of some of the new emerging jobs and technology forces. Crime discouraging investment. In a lot of our inner cities, there was the perception that crime was somehow chasing away businesses to be located there into the suburbs. Next, the availability of land, but land was underutilized or somehow stigmatized by contamination, which we call brownfields. Firms had come into the inner city, developed factories, polluted the water and soil, and then left. And in their wake, they left neighborhood folks that were impacted by that particular phenomenon. Turning the page, next slide, please. The lack of federal state commitment. There was a lot of talk, but a whole little action by the feds and also by the state governments trying to promote new ideas. The lack of metropolitan commitment, particularly in the permitting process for real estate development. It became very difficult to try to permit redevelopment projects in the urban core. So developers typically would go out to virgin suburban land and essentially leave development inside the city. The cost of doing business became greater because now you're dealing with inner city redevelopment as opposed to developing virgin land. And then finally, unfunded mandates. Namely, there were laws being passed without funds to help make those laws a reality. Next slide, please. For those of you that have taken Economic 101, I imagine most of you have, somewhere along your academic background. If you recall, the four major factors of production for a firm, for a business: capital, labor, technology, and actual land itself. You need some place to make this enterprise happen. Those same four factors typically take place in inner city neighborhoods in America as to how they make things happen with respect to revitalization. So I'll be talking to them briefly. Next slide, please. There are physical factors that deal with urban redevelopment. And these factors are physical in nature in that they're visible, they're tangible, you could see them at work, you could see them somehow impeding inner city redevelopment. First of all, land. Assembling land gets very expensive in inner cities. It could be very pricey. Its historical use, like I mentioned earlier, with respect to contamination, with respect to factories, with respect to non-compatibility, where you have houses right next to, let's say, landfills, has become a problem. The fact that most inner cities have existing assessments, that most planning departments throughout North America have actually engaged in some sort of neighborhood plan to help redevelop, revitalize, and guide the redevelopment process is critical. That is something that I think in developing countries you're going to see more and more of in the future. Next up, infrastructure. We touched upon it earlier. One of the biggest impediments to new physical development is the lack or the incompatibility of infrastructure, and financing that infrastructure becomes a major challenge. Designing the built environment. How are things going to look? How are the planners, the architects, the engineers going to develop strategies to take the built environment and have it influence positively the way people interact? Moving on, it's critical that from an urban setting you have to solicit the participation of the private sector. The private sector is the major economic engine to urban development. The public sector can only do so much. They can create the environment, they can create the incentives, but without the infusion of capital and dedication of the private sector, you're really not going to get too far. And finally, the big political question that I heard earlier: who is the customer? See, in the private sector, it's really easy to say the customer who pays the bills. The customer is the one that I'm manufacturing this product for, providing the service for. In the public sector, people like the council member and people like ourselves, I guess we could be called bureaucrats to some degree, we have multiple customers. It isn't just the oil company. It isn't just the local ministry of government. It is not the business enterprise that wants to come and invest. We have to deal with multiple customers, and that becomes a real challenge for us. That very challenge is the reason why I continue to be a public servant. Turning the page. Beyond the physical dimension of urban development, there are institutions at play in neighborhoods, anywhere I travel in the world. Understanding these institutions, understanding how they influence neighborhood revitalization and neighborhood actors and players is critical. I would argue that there are 6 such institutions that you need to understand what they are doing and what their agenda is for a neighborhood to move forward with progress. The economic, the religious, the educational, family, public health, and finally the political. You have to have a good feel for what they're up to, where are they duplicating, where are they overlapping, where they're sometimes in conflict in a specific geography. Next slide, please. Okay. Having said all that, I like to differentiate now between what we call strategies versus deals. In economic development, there's a tendency in North America to focus on the deal. Who makes the money? How do you finance a certain project? How do you basically make a transaction happen, a monetary financial transaction? I would argue for neighborhood revitalization, you need to back up and say, what is the strategy behind this deal? So differentiate between strategies to empower people versus the end result or output of that, which is the eventual transaction or physical development called a deal. First of all, on the short-term basis of strategy development, I handed out this particular little graphic here, this Venn diagram I'd like to turn to briefly. I don't have an overhead, so I'll kind of talk from my little, since we're an intimate group here. Imagine, if you will, from a neighbor perspective, you have a menu of things you would like to accomplish. You want housing, you want jobs, you want landscaping, you want a park, you want clean water, you want clean air. You want the whole kit and caboodle, as we say in the United States. But you don't know where to start, how to determine short-term versus long-term. Just imagine a very simple graphic model where you have 3 intersecting circles: internal capacity of the local neighborhood organizations, external support being provided by some external source outside the neighborhood, and something called value. Presumably, everything a neighborhood would like to pursue has some sense of value. If not, they wouldn't be interested in pursuing it. But also, they need to determine, do they have currently the internal capacity to pull it off? Or do they have to go to external support? If you look at the diagram closely, you're going to find a little area right here where internal capacity and value intersect in this little spotted area here. I would argue that that is an area where a short-term goal or objective or project can be pursued. It's valuable, and consistent with what they want to pursue, they have internal capacity. Let's move forward and implement it quickly. Okay? It's important that we have incremental successes with neighborhood revitalization, because if not, people want to plan and plan and plan and plan until the cows come home, and they get very bored and they get very agitated. On the other side of the equation, on the diagram, in this polka dotted area, there you have something that is determined to be valuable, but it's going to require external support. I would argue that's a longer term commitment where some external factor has to be brought to play to implement that particular project. And finally, the solid black area is where all 3 intersect. In a perfect world, that's where you would hope to operate all the time, what we call in economics equilibrium. Another major theme in urban America is micro-businesses. And I brought along a little article from San Antonio, Women Working Together. The council member mentioned the next revolution of the gender revolution. That is happening in North American cities as we speak, wherein women's groups and public housing projects are actually starting their own small businesses, operating them out of their homes. There's an interesting article you may want to take back with you on that phenomena in San Antonio. Finally on this slide, local versus regional. It's almost impossible in urban America to create all the jobs in one particular geography, one neighborhood. Invariably, the regional economy is going to have to be connected. And in this particular case, we have a handout from the planning department on a strategy they're pursuing called an urban telecommuting center. We're in a Latino community on the east side of town. They cannot go out and travel to the suburbs where the jobs are, so we're planning to create essentially an urban telecommuting center where they can essentially work over the computer to access jobs in the suburbs. Next slide, please. Now, the deals. There's always going to be a deal. And there are incentives that are available to deals. The issue, access to capital. Increasingly, public dollars and private dollars are being blended to make a particular real estate venture a success. It's important that you understand where the private dollars come from and where the public dollars come from. Real estate incentives, we have a little handout on that. Tax increment reinvestment zones, tax abatements, public improvement districts, and brownfields. This is incentives to help the property owner realize some savings when it comes to its development of its real estate. Employee tax credits. In some cases, you have tax credits in specific parts of cities and designed to help employ the poor and disadvantaged. Business tax incentives. Operating taxes that businesses typically have to pay either on their inventory or on their retail sales are also sources of incentives to get businesses to open up in specific locations. And last but not least, grants. Grants typically are made to nonprofit organizations, but we're seeing increasingly nonprofits partnering for for-profits, and the nonprofits bringing to the table grant dollars to the business. Very innovative strategy that's starting to emerge out of urban America. Okay, next slide, please. There we go. We have an opportunity here. I want to segue a little bit to something I'm working on currently, and that is the notion of matching up a group of young people from an African-American middle school here in the 3rd Ward that are artists, matching them with a cohort group somewhere in Africa, not to be determined, we haven't determined it yet, where they would essentially learn together about each other's communities from a planning perspective. And one of the components would be an actual business they would create together, perhaps focusing on art or services or planning. They would jointly realize some profits from that, and they would essentially look at export-import linkages, communicating over the internet or through teleconferencing, and conducting potentially annual visits to the host country, the export country. At this conference, we're looking to establish some ties with some African countries that have some arts groups that are youth in their orientation, and seeing if we could develop a cohort class, if you will, for the next several years to make this particular project a reality. We're now at the conceptual strategy stage. We're looking to actually implement this. So if you have any ideas, you have my phone number. It's on the front of the slides. Okay, to wrap up, some additional resource materials that I brought along copies of that might be useful to some of the conferees here. The same Council of Economic Development has put out a very useful handbook on Introduction to Economic Development Strategic Planning. I have copies of the table of contents here. I don't have the entire book, but if you wanted a copy of the entire book, I can make it available to you after you read the table of contents. Give me a call. It's on the front cover of the slides. Secondly, we mentioned earlier about the City of Houston's Department of Energy Corridor Sustainable Development Handbook. I have 10 copies available. I'll leave them for you. I think it's a very nice tool because increasingly what I'm seeing in Latin America, and I'm reading about it in Africa, is that international funding organizations are tying their initiatives to introducing principles of sustainable development, meaning that you cannot just continue to extract resources out of a country without dealing with the environmental impact of that. So we have a little guide on how to do that Houston style. It may be useful for you as you go back to your cities. I brought along 2 books, copies of 2 books. I cannot leave them, but they're excellent books on the urban economic development issue in America. The first one is by William Julius Wilson. It's entitled When Work Disappears. Dr. Wilson's a colleague of mine at Harvard. For many years he was at Chicago. He has written probably the most definitive public policy analysis on unemployment amongst African American youth, particularly in Chicago. This is his latest book, and I'd like to give this to you as a gift, Judon.
Thank you.
We've been talking about that for a while. The second one, and this is very analytical, a lot of data. So if you like data, if you like methodologies, it's very rigorous as far as methodologies. The other one is a book by 2 journalists. One is actually an ex-police officer called The Coroner. This particular book by Simon and Burns is basically the life and the year of a coroner in an urban black neighborhood in Baltimore. Fascinating narrative about what happens on this corner. Imagine if you had a camera pointed at a corner, I don't know, in downtown 3rd Ward at Live Oak and McGowan, and what you would see. in the interviews. This is a journalistic piece. It's not data-driven. It's more qualitative. This is also for you, Councilman.
Thank you.
Never be said that the feds don't come bearing gifts. We'll talk about that later. And finally, if you turn to the last slide, this is kind of the list of handouts I brought along, and it's also in your slides. It covers pretty much everything that we talked about in the presentation. I'll leave copies available out front if you would like to take copies home. That wraps up my quick little presentation, and I want to thank you for being a patient audience, and we'll see where we go from here.
Well, thank you, and if you would just give the panel a round of applause, please, because I think I want to thank Steve Tinneman, who is the new Deputy Director of our City of Houston Planning Department, who came in and filled in and pinched hit for us, and I was thank you, Steve, for coming in and getting in here. I particularly want to thank Antonio Flamenco and Dennis Thompson from EDI. Miguel Garcia, who made this tremendous closing presentation, was the one who brought your name as well, so he brought a wealth of input and important information to this topic, and I thank all of you for coming and just giving us an opportunity to try to have this dialogue. I think now, as we approach these areas more, we have even a better idea of how we might more institutionalize this kind of dialogue and shape this discussion. We have other resources from the City of Houston, from other people who are city employees who would like to give toward this effort of creating more sustainable, efficient and effective urban cities in Africa, and I look forward to you in continuing this work and meeting with you again and helping you in any way. I am your servant, and we are at your beck and call if we can help in any way. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.